going to speak to a very well-known apartheid activist, Rashied Omar, who was there in Cape Town, or here in Cape Town, on this very day in June 1976. From Soweto to Salt River, the 1976 student uprisings galvanized South Africa's youth to take to the streets. In Cape Town, a young Rashied Omar led several Salt River High pupils on a march to the Cape Town CBD. But they too were met by a huge contingent of riot police who beat the students with batons and fired tear gas. Omar was arrested and ended up in detention. Today, the activist joins us to reflect on what happened all those years ago. Rashied, thank you so much for joining us. We were just saying, Tapfuma and I, earlier, that the trauma that one must still feel about being beaten like that by police, even though it was 45 years ago, it must still linger.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so difficult, and some of us have taken a long time to actually process that trauma. But for many of us, we have continued to be social justice activists, so it was a kind of a baptism of fire. And many of us, we are grateful for having become lifelong social justice activists. I personally began to draw more deeply in dealing with my trauma, in finding inspiration for my social justice activism on my religio, cultural and inner spiritual resources in order to sustain myself, the same spiritual resources that we use in order to humanize ourselves, to sustain ourselves during those brutal years. Now, the remarkable thing I would want to say is that in the 1976 youth uprising, we were rejecting in Cape Town our apartheid classification as so-called coloreds and displaying solidarity across apartheid racial barriers, even though the apartheid state was attempting to impose the language of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in our schools. And for many of us, Afrikaans, or rather as our woke generation today would say, Afrikaans, was our mother tongue. Even though that was our mother tongue, we rose above racism to reach out and to show solidarity with our fellow youth in Soweto and elsewhere in the country. So it is lamentable that today, 45 years after that watershed moment of June 16th, 1976, and 27 years after the end of the apartheid and the onset of democratic rule, we are still suffering from racism and our apartheid socialization. And there is still unforgivable levels of racism and social and economic inequalities in our country. And it's for this reason that today is not only a day of celebrating the remarkable potential of our young people, but that we say, as we used to say in those days, a luta continua, that the struggle continues.
Absolutely. And Rashied, very, very quickly, is the climate in which you are now a social activist very different to the one that was that of 1976? Is the fear still there, or is it just more a sense of hopelessness?
Well, you know, it changed dramatically. You know, things never change. It's been almost, you know, four decades ago. So things have changed dramatically. We don't have this sense of hopelessness. I think that, or fear rather. The government in place, it's our government. You know, we have much more space for organizing. But I think the sense of hopelessness is a little bit more. So even back then, I mean, we used to have to keep on, you know, reminding ourselves that victory is in sight. And so I do think, especially for us as religious leaders, that we need to give hope and to say that we can, you know, beat the challenges that meets us. One of the key things that I think that is missing today is that of organizing. That we need to, you know, we need to strengthen our organizations at the grassroots level. So I think, in a sense, we need to turn our back on the state and to say that, you know, we need to use our energies and to organize our little communities and to wrest back power from the top onto the grassroots level. I think that's what's missing, is that in our neighborhoods we no longer know our neighbors. I mean, we have these big walls and we spend too much time floating in cyberspace.
Alienation, and as you say there, a luta continua. That was 1976 student activist Rashied Omar. Thank you so much for your time this morning.